To travel or not to travel? That's the question Pope Francis has been grappling with for the last few months, ever since his chronic knee pain confined him to a wheelchair.
E il medico mi ha detto di non camminare. A me piace andare, ma questa volta devo vedere il medico.
His long-planned trips to Lebanon, South Sudan, and the Democratic Republic of Congo were canceled at the last minute. But this month, the Pope will travel to Canada with or without his doctor's permission. With his limited mobility and chronic pain, why does Pope Francis insist on traveling to Canada? And why does it have to be now? But before we can answer that, we need context. Context that is found in the stories of Indigenous Canadian children housed in institutions run by religious organizations for over a century. They are terrible and tragic stories. Indigenous leaders met with Pope Francis in the Vatican to recount these stories in person.
Unfortunately, it has. It has its history. And so we're here to tell you the truth.
The truth is that from 1883 until 1996, the Canadian government took 150,000 Indigenous children from their homes and placed them in special residential schools where they underwent a re-education aimed at eradicating any trace of their culture and language and forcing them to adopt a theoretically Christian culture. Almost all the schools were run by religious institutions led by Anglicans, Protestants, and Catholics. Accounts describe government representatives separating children as young as 3 years old from their parents and confining them to the residential schools until they were 16. The children were forbidden to wear traditional dress, speak their local language, or celebrate traditional customs. Instead of their name, they were often given a number. These schools were poorly funded, and the children were malnourished. They were subjected to forced labor and endured all forms of abuse. Overcrowded living conditions meant the easy spread of disease. Over 4,000 children are believed to have died in these schools. Many of them are buried in unmarked graves. Often, their parents weren't informed of their passing. Those who did survive found it difficult to return to their communities. They could not speak the local language. They were rejected by their families who did not recognize them. Living as outcasts, many turned to drugs and alcohol. The Canadian Catholic bishops acknowledged that the greatest abuse was not what happened in these schools, but that they existed at all. The stories from the Indigenous leaders and the commitment to reconciliation by the Canadian Bishops' Conference convinced Pope Francis that he needed to visit Canada now.
Asking for the Holy Father to render an apology has this strong symbolic aspect because, after all, symbolizes the whole Catholic faith.
The Pope began preparations for the trips months before by holding face-to-face meetings with the representatives of Canada's 3 major Indigenous communities.
Per la deplorevole condotta di quei membri della Chiesa Cattolica, chiedo perdono a Dio. Vi do allora l'arrivederci in Canada, dove potrò meglio esprimervi la mia vicinanza.
During these meetings, some leaders addressed the Pope by his Indigenous name, Whitefeather, and presented him with a cradle similar to those Indigenous mothers used to carry their children.
I feel that the Pope and the Church has expressed a sentiment of working towards reconciliation.
Pope Francis understands that words alone are not enough. It is important to offer an apology, but it is just as important to offer healing and reconciliation in person.
E ora mi accingo a compiere un pellegrinaggio penitenziale che spero con la grazia di Dio possa contribuire al cammino di guarigione e riconciliazione intrapreso già.
Yet, there is one more reason why this trip to Canada is so important to Pope Francis. As a Jesuit and priest, he recognizes that for centuries, missionaries have spread Christianity to the ends of the earth, where the faith has been absorbed by the most varied cultures. But what happened to those children in the residential schools in Canada had nothing to do with the authentic Christian tradition of evangelization. Condemning what happened and seeking healing and reconciliation will not change the past. But this trip does mark an important step towards deciding how the Church will face the future. Maybe that's why the motto of this visit is walking together.